Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if talking therapies or even just getting active can help people with intellectual disabilities who also struggle with their mental health? Today we're diving into a super important topic that highlights a real gap in scientific understanding. Imagine a group of people who already face unique challenges, and then add mental health struggles like anxiety and depression on top of that. This is the reality for many adults with intellectual disabilities. Often they're treated with a lot of medications, which can be complex. But what if there were other ways to help them feel better? That is exactly what this research set out to explore. The big question the study tackled was, can things like talking therapies or even exercise actually help adults with intellectual disabilities who are dealing with mental health issues like anxiety and depression? And importantly, are these types of interventions even practical to put into place for this group? The researchers felt there wasn't enough solid information out there, so they decided to gather all the available studies and see what they could learn. Think of it like this. They wanted to know if these psychosocial interventions, meaning things that involve social and psychological approaches, not just medicine, are actually doable, and if they make a difference for folks with intellectual disabilities and mental health conditions. They looked at things like cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and even exercise and yoga. To get super clear on what they were looking for, they used a handy framework called PICO. The population was adults with intellectual disabilities. The intervention was psychosocial approaches. The comparison was often no specific comparison or treatment as usual. And the outcome they were looking for was a reduction in mental illness symptoms, specifically anxiety and depression. Now, how did they go about finding this information? They did a massive search across a ton of scientific databases, casting a wide net to catch any relevant studies. They were looking for anything that fit their criteria. After they collected all the search results, they went through them very carefully. Imagine sifting through hundreds of research papers. Many of them just weren't about the right topic, so they were quickly set aside. And here is where we see a huge part of the story that this paper is trying to tell. After all that searching and sifting, they ended up with only 4 studies that they could actually use in their review. That is a really small number, and it immediately tells us there is a big lack of research in this specific area. They even listed out why some studies didn't make the cut. For example, some were excluded because they focused on medication, not psychosocial interventions, or they weren't looking at mental illness specifically. This further emphasizes how precise their search was and how limited the available data is. So, the 4 studies they did include were 2 looking at the effects of an exercise program on anxiety and depression, 1 on cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, and another on CBT for anxiety. And here is another detail that is super important when we talk about the strength of the findings. All of these 4 studies involved very small numbers of people. We're talking about groups as small as 13 or 19 participants. Even the larger ones were only around 27 people. These studies looked at adults with mild to moderate intellectual disabilities. For instance, one study involved participants with a mean age of around 39 to 40 years old, with a mix of men and women diagnosed with intellectual disabilities. Another study had a younger average age of about 27. When researchers evaluate studies, they look at something called risk of bias. This is basically trying to figure out if there were any problems with how the study was done that might have made the results unreliable. For the exercise studies by Carraro and Gobbi, they found a low risk in most areas, but a medium risk for blinding assessors and participants, meaning they knew who got what treatment. The CBT study by Hartley et al. Had a medium risk for random sequence generation and allocation concealment. This means the way they assigned people to the intervention or control group might not have been completely random or secret, which can sometimes affect the results. And the Robertson-Kwan study, which used CBT, was rated as low risk. Interestingly, this was partly because it didn't have a control group, and many bias assessments don't apply when there is no comparison. Overall, the paper says all studies were rated low risk, but it is important to understand it is partially due to the fact that one of the studies lacked a control group, thus many of the assessments are non-applicable. This means the low-risk rating comes with some caveats. One really positive aspect noticed in all these studies was remarkably high participant retention. That means almost everyone who started the study finished it. No one dropped out, which is fantastic, especially when working with vulnerable populations where that can be a big challenge. Let's talk about the actual interventions. The Carraro and Gobbi studies used a physical exercise program. Participants did 2 one-hour exercise sessions each week for 12 weeks. These sessions involved all sorts of exercises. and the control group did a painting activity, which involved less physical effort but still had social interaction. The Hartley et al. Study and the Roberts and Kwan study both use cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. It is a type of therapy that helps people change negative thinking patterns and behaviors. They adapted it specifically for adults with intellectual disabilities. The Hartley study, for example, had weekly meetings for 1.5 hours over 10 weeks. To see if these interventions were working, the researchers used a lot of different ways to measure anxiety and depression. This included things like self-report scales, where people filled out questionnaires about how they were feeling, and also caregiver versions, where people who know the participants well also reported on their symptoms. They even used tasks to assess things like emotion recognition. One interesting finding from the Roberts and Kwan study using the PASAD was that out of 10 participants who started with depression or anxiety symptoms, 9 no longer had a diagnosis at the end of the study. The one person who still had a diagnosis saw their symptoms reduced to a less severe level. That is a pretty strong indicator that the CBT might have helped. However, not everything showed positive results. In the Hartley et al. Study, when they looked at social skills using the SPSS, they didn't find any significant differences between the groups. So, while mood might have improved, social skills didn't seem to change in this particular study. The emotion recognition task, or ART, showed some improvement for both groups in the Hartley study, suggesting that participants got better at identifying emotions. Tasks like the CMT and TFB, which look at how people connect thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, showed significant improvement over time in the Hartley study. However, in the Roberts and Kwan study using similar tasks, they didn't find statistically significant changes. This highlights that different studies can yield different results even with similar interventions. When it came to depression, the Hartley et al. Study found that the benefits of CBT treatment were sustained even 3 months after the intervention ended. That is great news, suggesting the positive effects can last. They also saw a significant decrease in depressive symptoms in the CBT group compared to the treatment as usual group. The exercise studies by Carraro and Gobbi also showed a significant reduction in depressive symptoms in the exercise group compared to the control group at the end of the study. So both exercise and CBT seem to have a positive effect on depression in these studies. For anxiety, the Carraro and Gobbi exercise study found significant improvements in anxiety levels, both immediately after sessions and over the entire 12 weeks of the program. They even noted that participants' anxiety reduced with continued exercise over time. Similarly, the Zhang Self-Rating Anxiety Scale showed a significant reduction in anxiety scores in the exercise group compared to the control group. And in the CBT study by Roberts and Kwan, they also found a statistically significant decrease in anxiety scores after the intervention. So, what does all of this mean? The researchers themselves are very upfront about the limitations. The biggest one is the sheer lack of studies, with only 4 studies and all of them having small sample sizes. It is really hard to make broad recommendations. They also point out that none of the studies were perfectly blinded, meaning participants and researchers might have known who was getting the real treatment, which can sometimes influence results. Another limitation is that some studies didn't have follow-up measurements to see if the benefits lasted, or they had other methodological weaknesses. For example, while exercise seemed to help reduce anxiety and depression, the researchers aren't entirely sure why it works so well. Is it the physical activity itself, or the increased social interaction that comes with group exercise? It is a complex question they suggest needs more research. They also mentioned that the increase in social communication and interaction from just participating in a study could have played a role in improving mood for individuals with intellectual disabilities who may experience less social interaction in daily life. This added social engagement could be a significant factor in feeling better. The studies were also quite short, ranging from 6 to 12 weeks. Longer studies would provide more robust evidence. And finally, the small sample sizes are a recurring issue. Having only a handful of participants makes it tough to be sure the findings aren't just due to random chance. Now for the conclusion. The researchers found no evidence that CBT or exercise actually made depression or anxiety worse in these individuals. In fact, the limited evidence suggests that these interventions can lead to reductions in symptoms. The Hartley study on CBT showed significant improvements in both depression and behavioral difficulties, reported by both participants and their caregivers. The exercise studies indicated that even short-term exercise regimes could reduce anxiety and depression. While these findings are promising, the authors stress that because of the small sample sizes and methodological limitations, they can't definitively prove that CBT and exercise have a significant impact. They can't be generalized to larger populations just yet. The bottom line is there is not enough research to say these psychosocial interventions are definitively better than medication, but they show real potential as an add-on treatment. They really emphasize the need for more high-quality studies, especially randomized controlled trials with larger groups of participants. They also think it is super important to explore how caregivers can be more involved and to properly assess the benefits of including them. So, what is my take on this? This research is a really important first step in highlighting a serious need. It is commendable that they dove into this under-researched area. The fact that they found any positive signals with such limited data tells us something important. These interventions are likely worth exploring further. The main takeaway for me is that while we can't make sweeping claims yet, there is a clear direction for future research. We need more robust studies with larger groups, better control, and that explore all the nuances of adapting these therapies for adults with intellectual disabilities. The potential benefits for this vulnerable population are huge. And it is exciting to think about how future research could pave the way for better mental health support. What do you think about these findings? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a like, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the world of psychology. Thanks for watching.